Все уебет. Ух, ебать, осколки полетели.
Final bit of breaking news. We're hearing that the Russians are reporting that Ukraine has now used these attacker and ballistic missiles. More on that later.
Yeah, it looks like an escalation is coming. Okay.
This morning, Ukraine fired U.S.-made missiles into Russia for the first time. That's according to officials in Moscow. The move comes just 2 days after President Biden gave Ukraine permission.
And a major escalation on the 1,000th day of the war. The attack comes just 2 days after the Biden administration gave Ukraine the green light to use the weapons against targets inside Russia. The White House policy change comes after North Korean troops were deployed to help drive Ukrainian soldiers out of Russia's Kursk border region. Overnight, Russian President Putin signed a new doctrine saying any major aerial attack against Russia could prompt reprisals with nuclear weapons.
So how do you believe, there's been a lot of big moments in this war. Do you think this perhaps is the most pivotal moment right now? And why do you think it's an existential threat for the future of Russia?
Well, first, let's start with two things. One, this isn't the first time that this issue has come up to the White House level. If you recall, back in September 13th, Joe Biden held a meeting at the White House. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, came to this meeting with a British diplomatic pouch inside which were documents that Starmer wanted Biden to sign, authorizing Great Britain to release the Storm Shadow cruise missiles so that Ukraine could strike targets deep inside Russia, and also have the United States do the same thing with the ATACMS missile. The day before, September 12th, Vladimir Putin made an appearance on television and said, if this happens, it will be a declaration of war against Russia and will be treated accordingly. That the United States and Great Britain will have become parties to the conflict. NATO will have become a party to the conflict. On September 13th, because apparently Biden didn't get the message, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations made the same thing, that a declaration of war will have been made if this happens. The Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, was in conversation, was called by people close to the Biden administration, no longer in government, but still talking, saying, is this true? And Antonov said, yes. Not only that, the United States will not be able to hide behind the Atlantic Ocean, that this war will go nuclear and the targets will include the United States. And at that point in time, Joe Biden backed off. We were one signature away from global annihilation. The reason why I bring this up is nothing has changed in the Russian calculus. Nothing has changed. Russia has said that these missiles cannot be used without being directly handled by the United States, that the targeting is done by the United States. Every aspect of the launch procedures is done by the United States, so that these missiles are used against Russian soil. It will be an American attack against Russia, and that's an act of war. Russia will treat it as such and respond accordingly. They said the same thing about the French Scalp missiles and the British Dark Shadow, I think it is, missiles. So the whole world knows where Russia stands on this.
If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
The plan to strengthen Ukraine is the Victory Plan, which I presented to our partners. One of its key points is long-range capabilities for our army. Today, there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves. They certainly will.
It didn't start in February last year. The war started in 2014, and since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine with training, with equipment, so the Ukrainian armed forces were much stronger in 2022 than they were in 2014. And of course, that made a huge difference when President Putin decided to attack Ukraine.
The decisions have already been made. The idea that Russia is going to go into some sort of conclave where Putin is going to be asking people what to do, how do we respond, is absurd because, as Vladimir Putin and his inner circle have said, the decision has already been made. If you attack us, we will treat this as an attack against Russia by the United States, and we will act accordingly, meaning we will strike targets not just in Ukraine, but in the nations that have attacked us. This is as clear a signal as can be. The Russians haven't deviated from their position one iota.
Overnight, Russian President Putin signed a new doctrine saying any major aerial attack against Russia could prompt reprisals with nuclear weapons. A spokesperson for Putin says this adds fuel to the fire.
This news comes a few hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin said the country has a right to respond to an attack like this one with nuclear weapons.
Putin has a new warning for the United States after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use long-range missiles supplied by the U.S. to strike inside Russia.
The Russian anti-missile system apparently downed 5 out of 6 of these missiles.
If that's the case, we may live through the week. But if Ukraine does in fact attack Russia, as I've been told, the decisions have already been made. There will be no discussion. Very catastrophic results for Ukraine and NATO will be the product of it. And that means war. And that means World War III. That means nuclear weapons. That means we won't celebrate Christmas. I just want everybody to understand what I just said. For all the people out there saying, well, it's not a big... You won't celebrate Christmas. You won't celebrate Hanukkah. You won't celebrate Eid. You won't celebrate Kwanzaa. You won't celebrate anything. Life will be over forever. That's where we're at.
So last night, after, a day ago, 2 days ago, we finally heard that the president had given Ukraine the go-ahead to use these U.S. long-range missiles at Russia. Ukrainian troops launched an attack against a Russian border region with 6 U.S. long-range missiles. This comes after, again, Putin approved the updated doctrine lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. How many times has this guy given us a red line and said, don't cross this or it will be World War III? And we've crossed it every single time. For a man who's backed in the corner, a man who is a bloodthirsty killer, you don't keep backing him into a corner. Or what happens? Eventually, he says, I'll have absolutely no credibility, and his people who have just been bombed with U.S. missiles, which he just said 2 days ago will be an act of war, has got to say, you know what? The worst thing I can do is not act because I'll lose all credibility in my own country and throughout the rest of the world. We have entered a moment of madness. What Joe Biden did is impeachable. Who launches 62 days before you're out of the office? Who starts World War III?
This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II. And Gorbachev said, that's very important. Yes, NATO doesn't move, and we agreed to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is when the so-called neocons took power. And Clinton was the first agent of this. And the expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. At that point, Russia didn't much care. There was no border other than with the Königsberg, but other than that, there was no direct threat. Then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was bad, by the way, because that was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But Putin became president, they swallowed it, they complained, but even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually asked maybe we should join NATO when there was still the idea of some kind of mutually respectful relationship. Then 9/11 came, then came Afghanistan, and the Russians said, yeah, we'll support you, we understand, to root out terror. But then came two other decisive actions. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This was probably the most decisive event, never discussed in this context. But what it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat. In 2004-05, we engaged in a soft regime change operation in Ukraine. But in 2009, Yanukovych won the election and he became president, and in 2010 on the basis of neutrality for Ukraine. That calmed things down because the U.S. was pushing NATO, but the people of Ukraine on the opinion polls didn't even want to be in NATO. They knew that the country is divided between ethnic Ukrainian, ethnic Russian. What do we want with this? We want to stay away from your problems. So in February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A typical U.S. regime change operation, have no doubt about it. And the Russians did us a favor. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now, between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who's a senior State Department official till today. And they talked about regime change. They said, who's going to be the next government? All of this is to say, the U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop. You promised no NATO enlargement. It's been, by the way, I forgot to mention, in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, 7 more countries in the not 1 inch eastward. And then, okay, it's a long story, but the U.S. kept rejecting the basic idea, don't expand NATO to Russia's border in a context where we're putting in goddamn missile systems after breaking a treaty. 2019, we walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. On December 15, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. You can find it online. The basis of it is no NATO enlargement. I called the White House that next week after that, begging them, take the negotiations. Putin's offered something, avoid this war. Oh, Jeff, there's not going to be a war. Announce that NATO's not going to enlarge. Oh, don't worry, NATO's not going to enlarge. I said, oh, you're going to have a war over something that's not going to happen? Why don't you announce it? And he said, no, our policy is an open door. This is Jake Sullivan. Our policy is an open door policy. Open door for NATO enlargement. That is under the category of bullshit, by the way. You don't have your right to put your military bases anywhere you want and expect peace in this world. They turned down the negotiations. Then the special military operation started. And 5 days later, Zelensky says, okay, neutrality. And then the United States and Britain said, no way. You guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front. You're all going to die. But we got your back as we kept pushing them into the front lines. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave.
If Ukraine uses an ATACMS missile to strike a target inside Russia, that is in Kursk Oblast, Russia will say that that's an attack by the United States and will treat it accordingly. It will be a state of war between the United States and Russia. And from what I understand, I've been in contact with sources in Moscow. First of all, let me just say that the Russians aren't panicked. What the Russians are saying is that the decisions have already been made. Anybody who's looking for a convoy of vehicles running to the Kremlin to decide, the decision has been made. It is automatic. The moment the ATACMS is used, Russia will respond, and the response will be catastrophic for Ukraine and devastating for NATO and the United States. When I say catastrophic, Kiev will be destroyed. It won't be a nuclear weapon, but I've been told what the weapon probably will be, and it'll be a gigantic thermobaric bomb that will level downtown Kiev, killing everybody there. Russia will take Kiev off the map. And if I know this, the CIA knows this, Biden knows this, Zelensky knows this. The thing is, they think Russia's bluffing. They don't think Russia will do it. It's not a gamble I'm willing to take, because it's not just gambling away the lives, millions of lives in Kiev, but it's gambling away all of humanity. If the West is wrong and Russia's not bluffing, there will be a war, and that war will be nuclear, and we will all die.